I am your host, Sarah Nolet, and this is my first live podcast. Anyone else's first live podcast? A few, great. Well, thanks for coming. It's really fun to have an actual audience coming to you from evokeAG here in Melbourne. I am pleased to welcome my two guests for today, Brad Fruth, Director of Innovation at Bex Hybrids, and Frank Wooten, CEO of archaea. Come on up. So I hope you guys don't mind a little bit of a Yankee takeover for the next hour or so. No Australian accents for a bit, but we will try to bring it back to the Australian context despite the accents represented. And we'll be talking a little bit about how we find this balance between what customers want in the agri-food space, what corporates want, and what the constraints are that innovators and investors face. And we'll be looking at that challenge from a few different perspectives and hopefully trying to find the sweet spot. Give you a little bit of a background on these two so that they don't have to say their bio and they can just tell me what I get wrong. So Brad grew up in the American Midwest and today lives on his family's hog farm in Indiana, raising 4 daughters with his wife. He describes himself as a recovering IT guy. And more than 2 decades ago, he joined Bex Hybrids, which is the largest family-owned retail seed company in the US. Inside Bex, Brad leads innovation, which we'll talk a lot about today. And there's no flashy corporate venture arm writing checks, but they get involved in innovation in a lot of different ways, which we'll talk about. We also have Frank Wooten. Hello, Frank. You guys are on the snuggle couch over there. I like it. Frank started off in finance and capital markets before co-founding Vents, a virtual fencing company that used GPS sensors and behavioral science to rethink how livestock are managed. It was ultimately acquired by Merck Animal Health in 2022, which we'll also talk a bit about. And today, Frank is the CEO of archaea, a biotech agtech startup still in the livestock space, this time developing a methane-reducing vaccine. So we will be digging into innovation from the founder side of the table, the corporate side of the table, and we'll see what we can learn. We'll start with you, Brad. Tell us a little bit more about your kind of background, where you grew up, and how'd you come to be in the world of ag via IT, it seems like.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for the opportunity to join you here, Sarah. So as Sarah mentioned, I currently serve as the Director of Innovation at Bex Hybrids. I grew up on a small farm in Indiana. Knew I wanted to get into the IT space, so I went to Purdue University. Honestly, I went there thinking I was going to go work for the federal government and applied for an internship at this company called Bex Hybrids. They were looking for a marketing intern, and the first thought through my head was, I think I can fake my way through that for 8 weeks. So applied, got an internship within their IT group, had no idea I was about ready to strap myself to a rocket ship. And have been very blessed to be part of the organization for almost 22 years. I was hired around employee 68. We're now around 1,100 employees that serve farmers in about 85% of the row crop market. So I had no idea I was going to end up in agriculture, but what an amazing place and an amazing space to work in. So at the end of the day, our team within the innovation space, we're problem solvers. So it doesn't matter if it's IT, if it's ag-related, if it's on farm, we just solve farmers. And the number one thing that we do is try to see how we can put money back into the pockets of farmers.
Awesome. And Frank, how about you? How'd you get into ag?
I like to say I got into ag dishonestly. I started in finance. I worked for about 12 years on the investment side, and one of the great things about that job is you get to go about 6 inches deep on 1,000 different things. So you get this huge variety of knowledge base and exposure base. But after a period of time, I was really getting disenchanted, I would say, with that world and not finding the depth that I really wanted. So I kind of went on this journey to find out what I wanted to be when I grow up. And I like to say that my wife will also tell you that I found that I don't want to grow up. And the way to do that is to become an entrepreneur. I had the really good fortune of having somebody in my network whose family was a 7th generation livestock farmer in New Zealand. And, just completely changed my paradigm of thinking. And the other thing that was really just this kind of contrast in life, was having LPs in my previous fund on the investment side that I was running who were completely aligned, said, look, we believe in your vision of the world. We're going to give you our money to invest. We want you to be a long-term thinker. And then, 2 weeks later, wanted to know why, we hadn't tracked what, Apple stock had done, over that 2 weeks. And the opposite side was kind of these, ranchers that would, had never met me, but said, you're not going to stay in the hotel. You're going to come live in my house for the next couple weeks and learn about my problem. And really, you're a partner to us. And by the way, if you screw up, it's a big deal, so don't screw up. But it was this completely different relationship that you're able to build with your customer. And that's what hooked me. It's a hard place to be an entrepreneur, but at the same time, the customer makes it worth it for me. So.
I tell a similar story, or had a similar experience where I kind of came into ag through the tech and sustainability lens, and then have absolutely stayed for the people, because there's just the table, the distance between business and family is basically nothing, and there's something really special about that when you kind of have that intimacy. It's also challenging in many ways when we talk about adoption and those kinds of things. Brad, tell us a little bit more about what Bex does and why you guys need an innovation department.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So as we mentioned, Bex is a family-owned and independent company. We were started in 1937, actually out of this new thing called hybrid seed corn. And as we've grown, what we've seen is, as we're now the third largest corn company in the United States, we're the largest family-owned, is that we really had a need as we were growing to create this white space for managers. And so one of the problems that we had was that, our company's growing 12 to 15% every single year since the 90s. And the challenge for a lot of our managers was, you're asking me to do 15% more every single year. You're not necessarily giving me more money or more people. How am I going to look at new stuff when I can't even, scale and get home at night? So that was the original thesis of our innovation group. As the folklore goes, also, when I was asked to start this new group, I said, no, I think that's the stupidest thing that we could ever do. Because traditionally what we had seen is that these corporate innovation arms from some other friends is that they thought that they could put people in a room with whiteboards and fancy IKEA furniture, and these unicorn ideas were going to come shooting out the other end. And I said, I don't want to work for a company where innovation happens in an isolated area. Everybody from the ground up within an organization should feel like they should force change. And so kind of the foundation of our innovation group was, how do we help these department managers as an internal consultant really evaluate and implement disruptive change? And a good day for us in our innovation group is when we're standing at the back cheering on our fellow teammates. If there's a bad day, I'm up on stage taking all the bullets. The folklore goes, I've almost been fired 10 times from Bex Hybrids. 11 happened 2 weeks ago, and I'm still here to kind of talk about it now. So that's kind of the antithesis of what it was. Now, I'll also tell you that, one of the big discussions was on this whole investing side. And, when I took this role about 6 years ago, at first I thought it was a handicap, right? Because all of our friends have these, corporate CVC arms. They've got all these people, and, checks are flying out. And what we found is that it actually wasn't a handicap. And so, at Bex Hybrids, we are farmers too, and what we found was a gap in the marketplace of really evaluating technologies, finding product market fit, advocating for farmers, because we also found there was, all these smart people like yourself that work for VCs, and they wanted to know what was making a farm impact. And then the startups were wanting to know, well, who can I talk to about capital? And, when I looked at trying to go to the family and say, you need to invest off your balance sheet, that's a pretty impossible thing to do when you're growing 15% per year and that capital is needed for your own business. And so what we found is that we could really help both sides of that equation and be a trusted partner, and we could do a whole lot more with other people's money than we could if we did it ourselves. So that was a learning that took about a year of failure. And going back to the table and really helping people. I think you guys talked about it just here. what we found in agriculture, it's all about relationships, and so whether that's at the customer side, whether that's on the finance side, no one is going to give you money or their business without a relationship. So that's what we concentrate on, and that's what we try to build this superhuman capability.
You've got to give us at least one example of why you almost got fired.
Oh gosh. Well, you work for a family-owned company. You need to stay out of the family politics. How's that?
Fair enough. Noted. Take note, everyone. On the corporate innovation point, like that internal consulting role, do you have any examples there of either like how it works, how you come up with priorities, how you get people bought into innovation, or like something specific that you got implemented and could cheer from the back of the room?
So working in a company for 22 years, like where all the bodies are buried because you buried them. And you also get the chance to build great relationships with people internally. So our team spends a lot of time understanding what the priorities are internally and how we can help. But it also looks radically different. So we have some departments where we are a partner with them. They're coming to us, asking us to open our Rolodex. How can we help introduce them to people? I have some managers that just want an intro or need help with a slide deck, and then there's some department managers that hate my guts, and all that's perfectly fine, right? So we are an internal resource, but we also operate a very large seed farm, and so we do a lot of work with our production team. We're trying to operate a farm at scale across many different states. So it's not uncommon for us right now. We're running a variety of POCs. We're running a variety of trials there where we're just like any other large farm. We have struggling labor. We need to farm more acres at a less cost. So whether it's robotics, whether it's high precision spraying, we do something in seed corn called detasseling. That's this weird thing that only us and 5 other people do. I mean, we're constantly looking for this technology, but we need to be matchmakers. And so we need to be able to bring these folks together in the same room. So that's kind of how we work. I would say the other thing, is being the front door for startup companies. We know that it is very difficult to approach a medium or large size company as a startup company, and y'all do a great job of stalking us on LinkedIn and sending us 1,200 messages, right? But we try to really be that front door and act as a concierge for the startup company. And so a lot of them come to Bex, knock on our door, and look at maybe some of the more visible marketing things. They're like, hey, I want to be a part of that. A quick conversation might say, we have like 5 different testing programs. So while you might have saw this shiny thing, you might actually need connected with somebody else. So just being that connector of folks tends to also be something of high value that we do for the company and also for startup companies.
So Frank, you were more on the startup side. Tell us just a bit more about what is Vents? It's still around. And along the way, what were some of your interactions with corporates? And we'll see if we can kind of compare the 2 experiences.
Yeah, I mean, so Vents is a virtual fencing company. So the concept, at its simplest was that farmers lack more skilled labor or time in their days, and that the big ROI unlock was enabling more productivity from the land, and that was done via being able to have dynamic fencing, right? So the ability to change how animals utilize a space, part of the space at different times and different times of the year, different seasons. All of those things were an unlock, and we saw a market or I saw a market where a lot of tracking devices were becoming available. And one of the things that happened when I spent more and more time with the customers is that they were constantly saying, look, I don't need more information, I need more action. And so controlling that primary asset for me was one of the big unlocks. And that was what drove me to jump in and ride that horse for a while. One of the things, as I said, and I wasn't being disingenuous when I said that I came by it dishonestly, one of the things I noticed in having spending a decent amount of time over here in Australia as well as New Zealand is my accent was off, and B, everybody can pretty much tell that I'm not a livestock farmer. I've gotten a little bit better at bluffing on that now, but it was pretty obvious, particularly when I got on the horse on the wrong side, and it took off running and threw me off it. Did
that really happen?
That did happen, and I had to get back on and
did that
ride
farm become a customer?
They did become a customer.
Makes sense.
But I rode for like 4 hours with a nearly broken hip, to get that contract. I'm not sure whether it was worth it for me, And I have this like simple mental acronym of BITE for customer adoption in ag. It's behavioral change, it's incentive, it's trust, and it's external factors. And the capital one is T, right? It's trust. And you can get trust in a number of different ways. If somebody knows that you've been a farmer your whole life, they trust that you are not going to screw them over, and that you know their problem set. The other way that for me was one of the ways that I actually sought out to gain that trust was to find trusted partners and have that be an indicator or a validator of us as a company and me as the interaction between them, that that I was trustworthy. And so early on, one of the main players in Australia and New Zealand that I sought out was Rabobank, because they had both a presence in the US as well as over here. And so I went to a bunch of Rabobank accelerators and stalked their people online on LinkedIn, maybe not 1,200 emails, but somewhere in that vicinity, and brought them on as an investor to one of our early rounds. And they were able to really put me in the room. Like many things, you get a foot in the door, and it's up to you to decide how to leverage or turn that into an opportunity. But they were able to put me into the door where people were willing to listen versus immediately take a skeptic's look and skeptical eye at us. And I would say that really helped us gain early traction with customers here, particularly in Australia, not as much in the US. We, in subsequent rounds, had two additional corporate investors. One was Shell and one was Merck. So Merck ended up acquiring us. But both of them had different aspects, which I viewed as positives and negatives. Happy to kind of dive into those more, with you. But I think that one of the real challenges with a large corporate is, there are numerous ones, but they happen to know their space or their vertical really well. I look at Merck now as a complementary potential partner, but they know so much more about vaccines than they did about technology. And that was a blessing and a curse for them. And so, if you're dealing with somebody who knows a specific vertical of the market really, really well, like Bex and corn, if they are your investor, they might know your business better than you do, which is, as a startup, intimidating. And you think you have a view of the world, and they have a much more nuanced and longer history as it relates to it that you don't necessarily have insight into, and that can create significant challenges with partnerships later on down the track as a startup, because the expectation bar could be drastically different.
So you mentioned Rabobank was an investor and then also served as this kind of matchmaker and trust, like social proof function. Was it important, or how important was it that they also invested? Just kind of comparing and contrasting what Brad said about not writing a check, but doing some of that kind of value add introductions.
Yeah, I think so. In my lens, and this is not me being on the other side of the table, but my lens was actually important simply from and I would say the same thing for all three of our corporate investors, simply for gaining mind share, right? We were the first investment that Rabo had out of their food and agro fund. And they made 10, I think, out of that fund, for example. And when I called, this is a 20,000 person company, and I wanted to get insight in terms of financing hardware, because we were a hardware associated with being put out. And I was like, okay, well, how do we reduce our COGS and how do we get a shorter payback period? I need to get hardware financing to effectively set up a viable business model. And they happen to have a huge hardware lending arm. It's like, this is great. I initially reached out to the guy in the hardware lending thing, and there was no response. But having the mind share of the partner, he could actually push me through to get connection. And I would say that happened in Shell as well as in Merck to many examples where it was like, oh, we would have sat in somebody's inbox for a year versus we needed a response 3 months afterwards. That may not be, I mean, Brad's superhuman, so he may just respond to all emails really quickly and be super efficient, but and get all that mind share. But that was certainly not the case. I didn't feel like that was the case for us.
One of the things that happens on the investor side of the table is like, where is the line for a startup engaging with a corporate that shows there's like actual interest? And so I guess one of the pros is if you actually have a check, then that shows a certain level of like commitment and validation. And if you're sort of in the middle of, well, we're doing a pilot and a trial and they made intros and they're keen and like that space, it can be harder to kind of show that externally as like we've passed the filter. How do you think about that, Brad, in terms of like helping your startup partners show to their other stakeholders that they've like kind of been past the test, so to speak?
Yeah, no. So I would say that instead of investing, like I want to become a customer. And I want to become a customer fast. I want to give you cash for services. And so, we are a little super choosy. We like to look for best in breed implementations. So, if we're going to choose a robotic platform, right, like we've looked at 5 or 6. And so the fact that we're a customer of one, we feel should have some weight on there. But for some folks that we chat with, they're like, hey, would you be willing to put some, pre-series money in or something? I'm like, no, but I would be glad to pay you for something. I know that this is a discussion point about free pilots. I don't ever do a free pilot, right? And I'm going to have to eat those words later, I think. But, if somebody's not willing to pay you for something, then they have now set the value. And in ag, you can fight me on this, but I have never seen anybody that has lowered their price be able to raise it in future months, right? So the quicker you devalue your product, the quicker you are to close and shop. So that's something that we chat with folks about. So the fact that we don't just open everything up and become a customer, like if we're choosing a platform, then we're like, we want to either embed you into one of our value adds, or I want to be an early adopter customer right now. And so it's just a little bit of a different lens. Hopefully we give an experience with our team where we don't have to put money in to influence, a callback internally. Sometimes we have the opposite where we've inundated them with too much. And so some of that I think is actually going through, I love the point that you brought up. We had to go through at Bex a little bit of we had to know exactly what we were good at. And some companies don't know, like, this is what I'm really good at. And so, at Bex, we are a seed company. However, we are a sales and marketing company that can deliver the best value per acre, hands down, And so there was some stuff we had to say no to where people were like, wait a minute, I thought you were a corn company. It's like, yes, but we're a sales and marketing company too, right? So those are some of the things that we go through. But writing a check for us and pay to play is not something that we found that we've had to do. And again, those introductions with other VCs that can write a much bigger check for us has paid off for us. So
it sounds like there's a stage implication there, like companies that don't have a thing they can offer you because it's not ready yet because they still need capital to build it. Like are probably just not the right.
Because there's some technology that we love. We're fully aware we're a distraction at times, and so we've had that discussion. Like, look, I'm a distraction for you. Like, but who in my network can I introduce you to that will fit that model? There's some stuff going on in animal ag tech that I would love to be able to operate. However, I'm like, whatever I bring, I'm just going to be. Your investors are going to hate me, so I'm going to sit over here and cheer you on.
On the founder side, Frank, what have you seen corporates get wrong with innovation there? That one example of sort of not knowing what you're good at, being a distraction, like what else have you seen?
It's a tricky question.
Because they're so good at innovation and they always get everything right. I'm sure.
Clearly. No, I think the challenge that you find, and like, we were a 30-person company and we got bought by a 60,000-person company, right? The order of magnitude of difference in terms of what we were doing and how we thought about product versus our acquirer is it's just incomparable. And so when you've got certain companies, and I would say, two of the main ones. I would say Rabobank was a little bit different than both Shell and Merck in this sense. But one of the things I saw very clearly was like this, just there's a huge innovator's dilemma problem that happens with some of these companies. We were a interesting area of growth for Merck Animal Health in technology, but really they make all their money in vaccines. Today, they're planning and growing into making them elsewhere. And so the reputational damage potential from a product which was not up to the standards of their vaccine products created a huge brand liability, effectively. And so when you're a startup, I mean, you've got your 10,000 collars out and you've got 5% of them failing, like you're able to go out and fix them and explain to the customers. But if you're a 300 billion market cap company that is one of the leaders in vaccines, like a 5% fail rate is like something that is absolutely unacceptable in that company. And so when you are in the middle of a product iteration, kind of part of your lifespan as a startup, and you get acquired by a company that is used to gold standard, you have a mismatch. And that's really challenging for both parties because both parties want it to work, and you just have like, oh, well, this is our standard, and they're like, well, we need to iterate 4 times to get to your standard because like these things are changing so much. And so that was a post-acquisition, that was a challenge, and I think that it's somewhat to be expected, and I think that is a natural artifact of just where companies at scale are versus where startups happen to be. I would say that like similar thing on the Shell side was where like the reason why Shell invested in us is that we spun up internally a carbon development platform for rotational grazing soil carbon at Vents. So we were basically taking existing customers and saying, if you rotate your animals in this particular way, that we can actually have a direct offtake partner to Shell. And one of the things that ended up happening was Shell had a bunch of bad press shortly after when they invested in us about some project in Indonesia or something that was falsified by somebody or some nonsense. And so then suddenly the effect of that gets translated down to us, and the standards become drastic. The bar just became so much higher than what we as a startup were able to hurdle and what we intended to hurdle, that you get this just mismatch. And we worked it out over time, but I think that mismatch is a big area of challenge.
I want to come back to the acquisition because, as folks know, acquisitions in agtech are not the most common thing around, and so I want to talk about that. But before we do, we talked a little bit about some of the challenges on the corporate side and like mistakes corporates make. What are mistakes that you've seen founders make when they're approaching a corporate, or maybe that you've made as well, Frank, if you're willing to share? I think, Brad, one of the ones you shared when we were talking before is like just focusing on the valuation and investor side, not the value proposition and the customer side. But what do you see when startups are making mistakes?
Yeah, so when we're not writing checks, I don't care what your valuation is. The higher the valuation is, the more I question if you're telling the truth or not, to be honest with you. So I don't really care how much money that you've raised. We are very, very focused on how am I driving net farm income and how am I putting money into my customers' pockets. So I could care less that you raise X amount of dollars. So I want to see real efficacy trials that are real, that aren't any type of smoke juice. I might also want to validate that with my own farming operation. But there is a perception out there that just because you've convinced some VC in San Francisco to write you a big check, that automatically that gives you credibility, and that actually is working against you. So that's kind of a big problem. The other thing is that we are very selective of who we work with. We go to network through about 1,200 independent farmer dealers. The other thing that we've had is people think that we're pay to play, and that's not how it works at all. So I don't care how much you discount something. This is not a sales transaction, right? And so that's the other problem that we've really seen. So we protect our customers and our dealers with our life, and we don't give access to it for many of the same reasons. I mean, honestly, when you're focused on customer service, you want to make sure that the company can scale, that they can take care of all of your customers across all the geography sets, and that they're going to give an amazing customer experience. So if it's two guys in a garage, I got a lot of questions, right? It doesn't mean that you can't get there, but we're just not going to hand the keys to the kingdom over right out of the gate.
So I want to unpack that a little bit because I was talking to one of our founders the other day, and they were actually getting questions from customers about like ownership structure and what kind of money they've raised and like just the maturity on the customer side about the company. And one argument is that comes from skepticism around venture capital and overfunding and incentives. Another could be like, we just want to make sure you're going to be here in 2 years, that you aren't two guys in a garage and you're going to pack up and go home. So what are you looking for in the kind of like, solidity of the company?
I always ask folks, what's your exit strategy? And not that there's a wrong answer, but if your exit strategy is that you want to build this up in 5 years and sell it, I'm dealing with an annual sales cycle. So that means I have 5 iterations before you sell this thing. And this might be an unpopular opinion, but I've never seen an acquisition to a big company where things get better, to be honest with you, right? Things always get worse. And that's the kiss of death, is when you get a phone call and you're like, hey, we got acquired. It's like, well, that's gone. Like, give it a year. They're just going to run this sucker in the ground. So so that question, there's no right or wrong answer. However, I'm going to look at you wildly differently if you're like, hey, we're here to build something. If you have a customer-focused mindset, then that tells me about how your attitude is. If you want to build it up and sell it, there's nothing wrong with that. However, we are probably going to treat you very, very differently because, we've been around for almost 90 years. We want to be around for another 90 years. So we've all had those experiences where we bought something from a company and then, one of the other companies buys it and you're like, well, this thing's going to pot real fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the most recent times, like buying it and completely changing the privacy policy of what was previously true.
Yeah, but there's been a number. Honestly, I would say the other thing is farmers are very aware too that if there's outside ag money coming in and ag portfolios are not investing in it, there's probably a problem there. And we all have lots of examples that we can think of off the top of our head.
So it's such an interesting challenge because this gets to the crux of, I know what a lot of people in this space are struggling with, like myself included. On one hand, you need enough capital as a company to build the thing, to make a thing so I can come to partners and say, you can be a customer, I can trial it, it's real. Someone has to give that funding or you have to be independently wealthy. You need to, if they become shareholders, have some kind of way to propose that they're going to get their money back at some point because it's not philanthropy in most cases. That expectation might not be $1 billion exit, so you're gonna have to figure out the risk-return timeline profile. Then you want it to be aligned incentives. Like it's a really tricky kind of equation here to fill out. If you could, I guess, wave a magic wand and the founder company comes in, like who are they backed by? Like what picture do they paint for you as like how they've gotten to where they've gotten and what their aspirations are?
Yeah, well, so I would say the other issue is that we know that if you're venture backed, that those folks are going to want out at some point, right? And so there's going to be a reconciliation that happens at some point. The other thing that really kind of grinds my gears is, there are startup companies that are hooked on the drug and they're way too bloated. And so they're like, well, I need to raise money because I need to hire 20 more people. I'm like, I work on a team of 2. Like, we're just trying to get home every night, and here you think you need another 20 devs. So the ones that we see that we have a lot of respect for are those, I'll use the word scrappy, right, that are really bootstrapping at a very, very high rate. And, if you're telling me that you need to raise money because you need another 20 devs, or the other one is I need, and I might be stepping on toes here, but I need to build out a sales force, right? Those are normally like, you have a problem where you don't understand that market. And so the use of how you're spending other people's money can be a really a really big problem. Was talking to a founder just a couple weeks ago that's building a platform that, for the record, I told him to close the company down about a year ago, and he proved me wrong. And I said, you go find one person right now that will write you a $10,000 check, and he did it, right? And he listened to feedback, and there's 3 people on that team. And what's going to happen is he's going to build that product up to, I would say, a respectable amount, right? He's not going to become a billionaire, but somebody is going to buy that thing, and he's going to, the people that did put in some early money are going to do very well. You know, if you've got, 500 people on a team and, you're all drinking the sparkling water, sitting in an office in San Francisco, you have a problem. So, sorry about this.
I don't mind sparkling water, but
it tickles my nose. It drives me crazy.
Tickles my nose. That's what we're going to call this podcast, then everyone can just guess what it's about. That'd be perfect. Frank, you're, Brad kind of a little bit roasted raising money in venture, and you're sitting in the startup seat, presumably
I'm just getting my veins ready for the drugs.
There's sparkling water somewhere over by
I got my sparkling water here.
One more round. That's all you need. One more round.
My drug kit over here.
Yeah. How do you think about the fundraising journey for Archaea, and what are you kind of aspiring for in terms of alignment with customers and shareholders and type of investor, Agtech or otherwise?
I mean, I think that, and you and I have had this discussion before, so this isn't, but I think venture returns in ag are generally a financing mismatch, just due to the hurdle rate of expected returns and the timeline in which those returns can happen. Do I think that there's still actually a very good model to make good money in ag? Yes. And I think potentially you could say that, if done right, the risk profile of it is lower than traditional venture. But in general, the exits in ag are sub $200 million. And so you need to be thinking through what an ROI looks like for your investor if that's the case. But as a founder, you have to always pitch that it's not the case, that it's going to be $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, $10 billion. And like Vents and Archaea were drastically different things, I would say, in that scenario. I always had a little bit of the view that with Vents, we had a very low number of potential acquirers, and that once we got over a certain valuation, we were like, there was no acquirer. So it was either you're going to go public with this type of business, or there's no other exit real strategy. It wasn't really another great exit strategy in my mind. You could talk about financial buyers, but not really. Like in Archaea, it's a little bit of a different scenario. So we have to build up a science team, and I think it's there are some similarities where in Vents their customers wouldn't trial something or pay you for something until you had a mature product. And so we had to build a team, build a piece of hardware, build it at a level that was commercially viable before we could get an actual market signal on revenues. What I did is went and spent a lot of time, didn't hire a sales team until, a year before we sold the company, but, went and pounded the pavement with customers and effectively pre-sold LOIs on that product as market signals. To say, look, at this price, this is what it looks like. You asked earlier of like areas where I think I probably tripped up. At some points when you're on that fundraising wheel, you're doing anything to get market signals. At least I was, and so I would signal. I was like, "Oh, would you pay 15?" And people were like, "Yeah, well, $15 we're great." And then I'm like, that was too easy, but that guy's already hooked at 15. Okay, well I know that, and so you're incented by investors to show whatever signal it is that gives them the trust to believe that either the market's there or that the product's there, and so along the way, sometimes those incentives really change what your behavior would be versus your natural behavior as a fiduciary of investor capital. And that, like, having come from the investor side, I always viewed that as my responsibility. I was like, okay, well, this is people's retirements, so each dollar that we spend maybe we bought some soda waters, but we didn't buy ping pong tables or things like that, necessarily. It was always like, okay, this is a responsibility. This is somebody's retirement. It could be my retirement money. It could be somebody else's, that we need to be thinking through, the allocation of that capital in the most efficient way. But to get that money, at times, you are reading the room from investors, and you get 50 investors ask you the same question. You're like, okay, well, if I had an answer to that question that was really solid, it seems like I would have moved to another level. And is that the right thing to do always from like a first principles of like what the business needs? Maybe not, but what the business actually needs is capital. And so you are achieving the greater goal of being able to build the company. With Archaea, we've got to do somewhat similar hurdles where we need to have a product that is going to need to be approved via regulatory agencies in order to vaccinate cows for our first commercial product. And so we can go out and we can pre-sell to people, hey, would you pay this? For carbon credits, would you do X, Y, and Z, and get indicators? But realistically, we're going to be 60 plus $million into the company before we actually have $1 of revenue. And my balance sheet does not look anything like that. And so you are forced to go find people who are either investing from a philanthropic perspective or from a venture perspective. And venture investors, they've got customers too. Their customers want 15% annualized returns, just like your family, at Bex. So I think it's a tough nut to crack. What's the right way to do it? My general view is that if you are able to paint the picture of what an outcome looks like that generates that return, and then it's the right path. I think that it is tough to do in the timeline that's expected from venture, though. To your point, it's tough to build a business and try and sell a product and then sell a business within 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think I would just add there, one of the interesting things, when you start talking about valuation, is a lot of people outside of ag don't realize that if you're a $200 million company in the United States in ag, you're a big deal. I mean, you might be the market leader in that segment. And so, our SaaS friends, as we were talking last night, can build a $200 million company in their basement with Claude code. And so it's just a difference. So getting investors tuned into what's reality and what's not is a real challenge.
I know our experience in raising our second fund at Tenacious has been personally confronting exactly this challenge, right? On one hand, a lot of the folks we talk to think venture capital, put it in a bucket, and then want to see a story towards $1 billion+ exits and unicorns, and that's the language that they speak. And I know I personally got to the point where the data doesn't prove that out in ag. It didn't make sense with the companies we were actually seeing that were doing well, that were solving customer problems in our Fund 1 portfolio. And there was still money to be made, but it was just I couldn't look myself in the mirror and promise them that story anymore because I didn't believe it. And so we did a bunch of work to figure out okay, how do we think we hit the target returns with a slightly different model? How much do we need to own? When do we need to enter? How do we support? How many companies? And then owning that story was a real unlock for us in fundraising, because we could say we kind of know this model doesn't work. If we come back to $1 billion outcomes, great, everyone wins. But if we hit $200-300 million exits, fantastic, that can work as well. But I think that challenge for founders is really real. So I want you to share more about what it feels like, because there are very few investors you can walk into a room and say, I want to raise money. You've got venture capital on your door, and I'm not going to tell you that there's $1 billion exit here. I'm not going to show you a hockey stick. I'm going to paint you a different story. They literally won't talk to you. They'll laugh you out of the room. And so do you tell that story even if you don't believe it? And this might not be true for Archaea because you guys are more in the biotech space. But I guess what advice do you have for ag tech founders who are grappling with the I need capital. I know what the investors expect, but I also have kind of slightly different expectations in how I'm thinking about building a business?
Yeah, I mean, so at Vents, it was kind of different than Archaea, as you said. Like, I look here at Australia, right? AACO is a publicly traded company. It's like 600 million market cap, rough order of magnitude in US dollars, it's between 600 and a billion. And they manage like 26 million hectares of land, 400,000+ head of capital. It's like one of the largest cattle companies on the planet, and it's like a sub-1 billion market cap company. So if your largest potential customer is worth $1 billion, it's tough to say like, hey, you're going to be acquired by that company for $1 billion. Like they're literally going to pay out themselves to you. Like you better have a lot of value that you're creating for that customer in order to do that. I think that there's always this scenario that happens on the venture side of like, you look at the Airbnbs of the world, right? Where it was pitched as a couch surfing app for the first bit of time. And it expanded into this hospitality thing. So one of the ways in which I think that happens in Silicon Valley, and I would say, by the way, like the average acquisition that happens in venture period is like $50 million. So like, it just so happens that unfortunately ag doesn't have $50 billion exits that have happened. Otherwise, you would see venture capitalists pouring over this space like rats, and that was not an insult to the venture capitalists, but like if said outcome happened, and like I think you would see a quick migration to the space. You just haven't seen it. I think $200 million exits are great. Like, and I think that living in that world is a reasonable world. But I think being able to paint a bigger arc, of like, okay, we're Archaea, we're going to build a vaccine. And by the way, our next arc is we're actually going to solve problems from the rumen. There's no company right now that's attacking animal health from a rumen platform basis, other than people who are doing feed additives. Suddenly, you're like, okay, we're not just sitting in a single product. We are actually talking about a platform that is targeting a broader market. And then you say, well, and also there's 90+% of the volume in the vaccine market is currently on generics. So there's a huge opportunity for us to co-formulate our vaccine and create category growth in what is a no growth to negative growth market right now. And we could co-formulate a vaccine at 10 cents a vial and have massive potential value creation. And you create these additional optionality layer-on stories that aren't stories, they're additional challenges, but they paint the picture of how you could be $1 billion company. You're still crystal clear on like, in order to execute as a founder, that you have to get A right before you're even thinking about B, but you're also demonstrating that you can look outside of your lane and say, if I achieve this, it does provide me the option to do these other things. And I think that when we brought Shell on as an investor, part of that was to provide the market with insight that if we achieve exactly what we wanted to do in virtual fencing, the ability for us to create further value for our customers is much bigger than just the pool of money that our customers were allocating at that point in time to fencing. And that actually optionality was something that I think opened up investors and eventually, our acquirers, us.
You touched on an Australian company at events. You were coming to Australia and New Zealand. Brad, this is your second evokeAG, I think, and so you've been spending a bit of time in Australia. Maybe a couple of reflections on the differences or similarities in the market. Like, is it a distraction for U.S. companies? I mean, for Australian companies to go to the U.S. and from the U.S. It's so much bigger. Why come to Australia? I don't know. Maybe Brad, you start.
Yeah, no. So that's why we're here, right? Is that we formed relationships. Actually, we were introduced a couple years ago to Andrew and Jossie from Swarm Farm, or I think I like to call them the Glitterati from Queensland. The whole point is we saw an amazing technology that we were like, how can we help this company, enter into the U.S. market? And so we have become friends with them. We have one of their units at Bex now, and we've been very impressed with the Australian market. There's also, we're here looking at a number of things in the grain grading side, and so a part of our job is how do we look at these adjacent spaces and say this technology is going to make a difference for us. Entering the U.S. market is different, so you not only spend times talking about getting away from milliliters per hectares to ounces per acre. That's the first challenge because I'm not a smart guy and I don't like to take off my shoes when I'm mixing chemicals. But the second part is also just it's the dynamic of how to sell into the market. So we use an independent model. There's what we call the ag retail model, and so that go-to market strategy is also something that we spend a lot of time. We have an opinion, however, there's just an education, right, that needs to occur there. So, we've seen the same thing out of Brazil. There's a number of Brazilian companies that have tried to enter the U.S. market, and they've just copied what they've done there. That has not ended well for them. So we have, again, some amazing founders. The depth and breadth of the companies here is interesting. I mean, we come from the monocropping world. We're pretty boring. It's corn and soy, and it's awesome to see the diversity of crops here. And so we're very excited to be tapped into the ecosystem here. Again, we don't sell in Australia. However, if we're looking for those technologies that we can bring back to either our farm at Bex or that we can bring into one of our value adds. So,
cool. Frank, views on Australia, New Zealand?
Yeah, I think that sometimes the U.S. market size is deceptive, though. So, people, the main reason that I probably was not 100% Australia, New Zealand focused out of the gates is because U.S. investors discount so heavily Australia and New Zealand revenues. Otherwise, I probably would have been like, okay, we're going to set up company over here, and we're just going to focus here. But realistically, the cost of capital from raising from investors in the U.S. was lower, and in order to meet that, in many senses, I needed to focus on the U.S. market first. I think I'm focused more on the livestock version of the world, and in that version of the world, the customer concentration here is much higher. Particularly, you look at Fonterra in New Zealand, or you look at Queensland in terms of the major pastorals. There's just a customer density that you can get to that you don't need a sales team to achieve, right? The average cattle farm in the U.S. is about 42 head of cattle, and the average cattle farm in Australia is 454, somewhere in that order of magnitude. And you go up into Queensland, it's even higher, right? And so you could be all right, well, I'm going to attack one state versus 50 states, and in those 50 states, I could go to Brisbane and sit down with 5 million head of cattle in 2 days, or I can go to 20 states in the U.S. and have to drive 10,000 miles and not achieve the same goal. And the corporate infrastructure related to those, at least on the cattle side, the decision-making logic is less emotional necessarily. I'm not saying it's without emotion, but it's less emotional, and there's a willingness to experiment. I think that part of the U.S. environment has, and you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, where we have government subsidies to bail out farmers, right? It's one of the artifacts of the current system there. And to survive, I would say that ranchers and farmers in Australia and New Zealand have found different ways to do things to keep themselves profitable and to survive, not expecting a bailout from the government. And so that means a willingness to try new things. And so for me, I would say it's almost inverted from your question, where I'm much more interested in being here. I'm required to be there in some senses in the U.S. just from an investment fundraising perspective. But otherwise, I would have much more focus over here.
I want to do one more kind of reflection question from both of you as we wrap up here. So, Brad, I guess reflecting on the sweet spot of innovation, we've talked at many evokeAGs over the years and in the ecosystem about corporates here, and are they good at innovating? Should they be writing checks in venture funds? Should they be exploring more? What advice would you have to corporates about how to get more involved in or be better at or get more value out of innovation in ag tech?
Yeah, well, Sonny Beck tells us all the time, find what you're good at and do more of that. And so at Beck's, that was not investing. That was being extremely farmer focused. I mean, it took, so I went from working on the IT side of our fence at Beck's, where you got instant notification if what you are doing is working well or not, to on the innovation role, I literally got 100 no's out of 100 times of the projects that I pitched internally. But through all those no's, got to really challenge the organization to be honest in what we were good at and what we were just absolutely horrible about. So I think there is a little bit of soul searching that as corporates, you have to know what you're good at and where your strengths are, and then partner on the rest of that. So some people view this space as an arm of their R&D. We don't do that. We are again looking for ways that we can help commercialize and extend. So that's probably been the biggest learning from our side. Not only am I a complete and utter failure, but also being really honest in what we're good at and where we can help others.
Awesome. And Frank, for you, reflecting on the journey of getting acquired, it would be, an outcome that many startups and investors in the space would want, maybe many corporates as well. Like either what advice would you have, or what are some things that you might be doing differently this time around in reflecting on the journey of being acquired by Merck Animal Health?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that we touched on earlier is the valuation side of things. I think just being realistic as it relates to the investment outcome side of the world. Whatever your niche is, know who your 5 most likely acquirers are, and know what they have paid in the past, know how big of a company they are, know what gaps there are in their portfolio, and be realistic as it relates to that. I think that when we sat down at the table with Merck, we were always completely transparent. It was actually a very seamless transaction in that sense. I would say my deepest respect goes to that team that worked through the acquisition there, because honestly to a T, it was this is how this process will go. Your expectations should not be here. And I was your expectations should not be here. And everything worked out completely perfectly as it related to that. And I think that was a function of having a very candid and transparent relationship. I find that, for me personally, that's part of my brand, that I like to be look, as it relates to what we're doing right now, here's where we are, here's where we think we should be. I know it's not exactly X, Y, and Z, but this is where we are, and we expect we're going to get here. And here are the risks associated with that. And I find that people get sold so much nonsense that they are really refreshed by somebody who's look, here are my weaknesses, here's what my expectations are, and if that doesn't work for you, peace. We are good. Don't waste more of my time, I don't waste more of your time. I think on the acquisition side, when you look back at it, and I constantly believe that it was a bit as much luck as everything else. And so I think you have to just be very humble about that. Our acquirer needed to fill a certain percentage of their portfolio, fill something out in their portfolio, and we happened to be raising, and they happened to be X, Y, and Z, and we did a lot of things right to get there, but it was still a lot of luck. And so banking on that would just be I don't know. I'm not smart enough to have Machiavellian planned things out that way. So I would not bank on you being the person at the right time for the right acquirer at some wrong price.
I think that's a very good note to end on. For those of you who regularly listen to the podcast, if there are any of you out there, I often end with some takeaways. I usually have a bit more time to come up with what my takeaways are, and a great producer who helps with that. But I actually do have a couple. So one is actually the point about just different models of corporate innovation and playing to your strengths, but that there isn't a one-size-fits-all toolkit for that. And I think that's really important as corporates in Australia think about innovating. The second is the discussion about capital plan alignment is what I would maybe call it. And I think, Frank, you highlighted the difference between like execution focus and your vision and the stages you could get to, and that those are actually two separate things and two separate skill sets in kind of how you fundraise and how you build a company. And then the third is that like Australia does have a value proposition in ag, and I'm always interested when you get Aussies on stage at places like evokeAG, and there's a lot of like, we have to go to the US, or we're not doing it well enough. And then you get Americans on stage and they're like, Australia's great, like do more here. So just that juxtaposition I think is super interesting. But thank you guys so much for joining me in the first ever Agtech So What Live. Massive thanks to the audience, thanks to AgriFutures, thanks to evokeAG, and thanks to our producer Kirsten at Rural Podcast Co. That is it for us. We'll catch you on another live Agtech So What tomorrow, and hopefully you check out the podcast if you haven't. But that's it from us. I'm Sarah Nolet. Catch you next time.
Thank you. You too.